Alright, so this is a lecture video for my biological psychology class at Mississippi State, specifically my 11 o'clock section, so section 2. I do apologize that I had to end class very abruptly on Thursday. I had a medical situation arise that needed my immediate attention. So the purpose of this lecture video is to finish up that information that we would have covered in class on Thursday so that we're not behind because we do have an exam coming up. So in this set of slides that we were covering on Thursday, we did finish talking about development. We only had a few slides left there, and then we started chapter 12 on sexual activity. So we had said that your textbook specifically is interested in reproductive behaviors. So that's why you'll see the sexuality slides limited specifically to sexual encounters that could end in reproduction. So we were talking about how there are 4 stages here. So we already talked about sexual attraction and then appetitive behaviors, so those behaviors that make sexual encounters more likely to happen. So the 3rd stage here, at some point my life took a turn, and now I find myself lecturing to college students about copulation and coitus. So that sort of makes me question some of my life decisions perhaps. But here we go. Copulation or coitus involves one or more intromissions. When you see this term intromissions, what it means is penetrations in which the male penis is inserted into the female vagina. I'm going to assume that even if I was doing this lecture in class as I had intended to, you probably wouldn't have too many questions about this point. Okay, so following stimulation, the male ejaculates sperm-bearing semen into the female. Alright, a couple of things to think about here. Is it necessary for the male partner to have an orgasm in order for reproduction to happen? Yes, we need that semen. Is it necessary for a female partner to have an orgasm in order to conceive? No, not necessarily. Although there is some research to suggest that if the female partner has an orgasm, that might make conception a little bit more likely. Perhaps the muscle contractions might help guide the sperm to where they need to be. So not necessary, but perhaps helpful. Alright, so what happens after copulation? Well, it talks about a refractory phase here. Perhaps when we were having our lectures on action potentials and we talked about absolute versus relative refractory periods, perhaps some of you guys were anticipating that this conversation might come up later. So when we talk about a refractory phase, that means that an individual is less likely to engage in sexual activity again afterwards. If we had an absolute refractory phase, that would be a time when the individual is not able to, like we cannot have sexual activity. But then a relative refractory period might mean that the individual could engage in sexual activity, but it would be a little bit less likely. So more about refractory periods coming up. One thing to note here is the terminology that we used. I think we discussed this a little bit before we ended class on Thursday, but if a female is showing those appetitive behaviors, they use the term proceptive for that. So it's showing that she's interested without necessarily giving consent. And then if a female is willing to copulate, willing to engage in intercourse, then she would be termed receptive. Okay, now other terms for this could be in heat or estrus. These terms, although they could technically apply to human females, seem a little derogatory. Usually we think about these terms with animals. Like, for example, I am not a hunter, but my understanding is that you can use this to your advantage if you're hunting, like deer, for example, using certain smells that might attract a male deer because it smells like a female deer that is receptive. So I believe there may be some applications for this, but also in research, if a female is willing to copulate, then she is termed receptive. Alright, good. Now, post-copulatory behaviors. What happens after a couple engages in sex? So this could vary across species. One thing I just had to include, this is in your textbook, and I really wish that I could have shared this with you face-to-face and seen your reactions, but there's an article here about a guinea pig. So, having escaped from captivity, a male guinea pig re-entered captivity in a nearby cage housing 24 females. 2 months later, he is now the father of 43 offspring. According to his owner, we did a head count. found out that he was with the females. He was fast asleep in the corner. He was absolutely shattered. We put him in his cage and he slept for 2 days. Okay, so perhaps sleeping for a long period of time might be one postcopulatory behavior. But really anything that an individual does after copulation can fall in this category. One thing to think about here would be parental behaviors. So if you think about this in humans, there would be a 9-month period of pregnancy. So that's a pretty long delay between the copulatory behaviors and the post-copulatory behaviors of parenting. But still, technically speaking, parenting would be a behavior that would come after copulation that would nurture offspring. So different species will handle parenting different ways, in part depending on the route of fertilization that is used. So it talks here about internal versus external fertilization. Internal fertilization will take place inside the female's body. So what we have here would be sperm and egg. You see the term ova here, that'd be plural for eggs, coming together. So gametes is the term for sex cells. The female sex cell would be an egg or an ovum, and the male sex cell or gamete would be the sperm. So when you have a sperm and an egg come together, you have a zygote, which is a single fertilized cell that will then begin to divide to produce the offspring. So with internal fertilization, this is taking place inside the female's body. So this would be something that mammals, almost exclusively, I guess our platypus friend might be an exception to this, but mammals, of course humans, fall in this category of internal fertilization. So there are some advantages to carrying the offspring inside. So this might provide a more stable environment. So things like temperature changes or nutrition would not be a problem, assuming that mom is getting adequate nutrition wouldn't be a problem. And then also there is protection from predators, that kind of thing. On the other hand, a potential downside to internal fertilization is that there is a limit to the amount of space that a woman has. So you might have heard of cases of women having like 8 babies at one time. I suppose that might happen in extremely rare cases, usually 1, and then possibly multiples. But when it comes to external fertilization, that gives the opportunity to have many more offspring. So this is going to take place outside the female's body. So the female would lay the eggs, and then the male would fertilize the eggs with their sperm. And then sometimes that's the end of it for the adults. They leave and they don't stay to parent the eggs, to protect the eggs. There may be some species that do protect the eggs as well. But with external fertilization, there's not really a limit on space. So you can have many more offspring, which would be helpful, because the downside to external fertilization is that that protection against predators and that stable internal environment is not an option there. So if you think about quality, that's internal fertilization, versus quantity, external fertilization. Different species handle this different ways. All right, so make sure I didn't skip something there. Okay. When we're talking about reproductive behaviors, hormones are definitely important. And when I say hormones that are involved in reproductive behaviors, probably testosterone is the first one that comes to mind. So females also do have lower levels of testosterone. Males have lower levels of estrogen, which we'll actually talk in class on Tuesday about how that's important, that males do have some estrogen in their system. But we know that males tend to have higher levels of testosterone than females. What happens when a male is castrated? So when we're talking about a castrated male, we're talking primarily about animal research, because this is not something that is intentionally done in humans, but could perhaps be done in a human if there was some type of cancer or accident, that kind of thing. Castration would refer to a situation where an individual's testes have been removed. So the testes produce testosterone. More on that coming up. So what that means is that if a male is castrated, that testes are removed, then the individual would no longer produce testosterone. And because of that, the individual would no longer be interested in sexual behaviors. Having said that, we do see that testosterone that is administered to that individual can briefly cause that person to want, or animal, whatever the case may be, to want to engage in sexual activity again. So this is an activational effect. An activational effect means that you introduce some type of treatment that has a brief effect on behavior. Not a long effect, but a brief effect. So if we take a mouse that has been castrated, who is no longer interested in copulatory behaviors because the mouse is not producing testosterone, if we give him an injection of testosterone, he will become interested in copulatory behaviors again for a short period of time until that testosterone wears off. Okay? What about the hormones that are more considered female, although, as I said, estrogen is present in males and important for males. We'll talk about that on Tuesday. So estrogens are going to be produced at the beginning of the ovulatory cycle. Okay, couple things to say here. Males do not have this cycle of fertility the same way that females do. During childbearing years for females, so in between puberty and menopause, a woman is going to have a monthly cycle. We say monthly because on average it's about 28 days. For different women it's different lengths. But about halfway through, so on around day 14, if a woman has a regular 28-day cycle, an individual will ovulate, which means an egg will be released. So one thing to know is that the days leading up to ovulation and like the day of ovulation, that's the time when sex is most likely to result in a pregnancy. Now, what's happening there is that sperm can live inside a woman's body for 5 to 6 days. So having sex 5 to 6 days out from ovulation could still potentially result in conception. But then having sex like the day before or the day of ovulation is probably the most likely time that an individual would conceive. Now, that is information that is helpful if you were trying to conceive. That is not necessarily information that is helpful for birth control purposes because it is true that that's the time period when a woman can conceive, but you don't always know exactly when you're going to ovulate, and it may be possible that a woman might ovulate in a way that's not expected, maybe release multiple eggs, that kind of thing is possible. So I don't tell you guys that for you to use that information as birth control. I just tell you that for your general information, okay? So estrogen is not the only hormone that's important for this cycle in women. Progesterone is important as well. So you'll see that as a woman gets close to that time of ovulating, estrogen will have a sharp spike. Progesterone will also go up somewhat as well and will continue to go up afterwards. So what we're seeing is that these hormones are important for that proceptive and receptive behaviors. Remember that proceptive behavior is involved with appetitive behaviors. A woman is showing interest, but not necessarily consent. And then that receptivity is going to be what you're going to see when an individual is consenting to intercourse. Okay, now, pheromones are an important concept to include in this discussion because they are chemical signals that communicate information, usually used to coordinate their reproductive activities. So some species release pheromones, and that is a signal to others of their kind that they are sexually receptive. So your textbook talks about this happening in goldfish, which I was not aware happened in goldfish, but some insects release pheromones, and that helps partners find them because they can detect those pheromones. A couple other things to say here. First of all, it also says that pheromones can convey information between individuals of the same sex. So your textbook gives the example here of elephants. Apparently, in a herd of elephants, it's similar to some other creatures where there's a hierarchy of males. So you have your alpha male, the leader of the pack kind of thing. And then you have the younger males that are considered less in charge. So what can happen is that the alpha male will release pheromones of a certain type and smell, and those younger males that are less important will release a different smell. And the thought is that that could help prevent arguments, could help prevent fights between males, as if we're releasing a scent that says, hey, I'm not a threat to you, there's no reason for you to attack me, that kind of thing. One other thing to say here when we think about pheromones in humans, it's not exactly the same process. However, there was a research study done, prepare yourselves, this is kind of weird, where they had women wear pads under their arms to collect their essence during various times of the month. and then they had males come in and smell those pads. Now, the males that were doing the smelling never saw the females. That it was just a smell thing. They did not see the women that produced the smells at all. But they reported that the smells of the pads that corresponded to ovulating females smelled more pleasant to them, more attractive to them, than the smells of females at other points in their menstrual cycle. So kind of weird, but perhaps we find ourselves subconsciously, we may not be aware of it, but subconsciously attracted to females or to individuals who are most likely to be particularly fertile at that moment, if that makes sense. Okay, so when we talk about studies in sex, we're often talking about animals because some things are not ethical to manipulate in humans. We've had this conversation. Perhaps it's easier, and perhaps we're more comfortable studying sexual behaviors in animals. So up until not that long ago, I don't remember exactly when Kinsey was doing his research, but not that long ago, most of our research was on animals. But then Kinsey came along and started this asking questions, filling out surveys about sexual behaviors in humans. And then after him, Masters and Johnson came along and actually did some observational research in sexual behaviors. Once again, if you're interested, there is a class at Mississippi State, human sexual behavior, that might be a class you're interested in taking. But here we learned from those research studies that there are certain patterns that correspond with human sexuality. Now, one thing I will say is that there is a concern that the individuals who are willing to be observed while engaging in sexual behavior might not be representative of the general population. But that's the results that we have, so here we go. We see that humans differ not so much in their reproductive anatomy. The reproductive anatomy is not that different from most species to the next. However, a variety of reproductive behaviors that humans engage in, as well as their ability to talk about those behaviors, such as reporting an orgasm. It may be difficult to know for sure if animals experience orgasms in a similar way to humans because they can't report their subjective reactions, but we can see that in humans. So, based on the work of Masters and Johnson, we're going to see that there are 4 phases to the sexual response cycle, and you're going to see a couple of graphs coming up. So excitement, plateau, orgasm, and then resolution, so whatever happens after orgasm. Now, what you'll see is that there are graphs for men as well as for women, and they differ a little bit. Women tend to have a greater variety of responses. You'll see what this means in a second, but not all women have orgasms. Some women have multiple orgasms. You'll see that in a second. But one thing to note is that men, but not women, have an absolute refractory phase. Okay. So if you hearken back to our information about action potentials, it's along the same lines. When we're talking about an absolute refractory phase following orgasm, that means that an individual is physically not capable of engaging in sexual activity again for a period of time. So absolute refractory, we talked about action potential, the neuron just can't fire again. Absolute refractory here, the man just cannot engage in sexual activity again. Then that's going to be followed by a relative refractory phase where it might be a little bit less likely that an individual engages in sexual activity again, but could technically do so. Now, there is a question here about, do women have a refractory period? Women don't have an absolute refractory period, as in they're not biologically capable of engaging in sexual activity again. They may have a relative refractory period in that they may be a little less likely to be interested in sexual behavior right after having engaged in sex. But that might be a matter of debate and individual difference. So here you're going to see that this is the standard pattern for males that may not apply universally, but the majority of males follow this general pattern where you have an increase in sexual excitement up until a plateau where the excitement kind of levels off, and then at some point you reach a threshold of sexual interaction and excitement, and then that results in an orgasm. Okay, and then after that, you're going to have an absolute refractory phase where the individual will not be able to engage in sexual activity again, and that may be the end of the story. Or after that refractory phase has ended, then the individual might engage in a second sexual encounter and then have orgasm, and then once again have that absolute refractory phase. So what we're saying is that a male is not biologically able to engage in sexual activity again for a time after orgasm, which the exact amount of time is going to vary from species to species and from individual to individual within that species, and maybe from situation to situation. All right. On the other hand, we have a graph here with female sexual response patterns, and you'll see that there are at least 3, and probably more, but we have 3 here from Masters and Johnson's research. So if you look at the blue line, there may be some individuals that have that increase in excitement, have a longer plateau, and then have multiple orgasms, which is something that is not possible for men because of that absolute refractory phase. And then after that have a resolution. So you could end up having one orgasm and then sex ends, or maybe having multiple orgasms as well. If we look at this red line, there may be some individuals that have an increase in excitement and then a very long plateau, and then sex ends, and this individual does not reach the threshold of having an orgasm. Or it may be that some women have a very steep incline in excitement without really having a plateau, and then have an orgasm relatively quickly. So this is just a few patterns, and perhaps there could be more patterns to female sexual activities. So a couple other things that we've noticed that are different between men and women when it comes to sexual behavior. Women tend to report that their likelihood of engaging in a sexual activity initially or later on is impacted not just by physical desire, but also by thought processes and emotions. So women are more likely to say that they make the decision about whether or not to have sex based on a combination of a desire to have sex, as well as an emotional relationship with the individual, and also considering how well previous interactions with that partner have gone, right? So making sure that women are considering both emotional intimacy and desire, as well as considering past encounters when they try to make a decision about if there's going to be a future encounter. Now, this is what women say on a survey. It's certainly possible that there may be some women who tend to make this kind of decision based solely on physical desire, and maybe they don't want to put that on a survey because there's a sexual double standard that perhaps we judge women more harshly for engaging in behavior strictly on desire and not including an emotional component, but this is what women will say on a survey anyway. Alright, now we know that hormones are important for sexual behavior. The question is, what kind of role do they play? Well, hormones only play a permissive role. What this means is that you have to have a certain level of hormone in order to engage in sexual activity. But as long as you have at least that minimum, then you don't have to have an excess of hormones. Okay? A couple of things. So if you have individuals that do not produce androgens, so when you see this term androgen, it's talking about male sexual hormones. Testosterone would be an example of an androgen. So if we take our mouse that is castrated, who does not produce testosterone, if we give him a low dose of testosterone, he will start to have interest again in sexual activity for a short period of time. That's the activational effect. It doesn't take much. You only have to have enough testosterone to reach that minimum level. Okay, as long as you have that minimum level of testosterone, then you don't need any more than that. So there's no correlation between overall androgen levels and sexual activity as long as an individual has at least that minimum amount. So what I'm saying here is that if you have one man who has the minimum amount of testosterone and another man who has a good bit more than the minimum of testosterone, we wouldn't expect to see a major difference in their sexual activity. So there are some products out there that people sell to try to encourage individuals to well, they say, okay, well, if you take this product, it will increase your testosterone, it'll increase your sex drive. Probably not. If you have the minimum level of testosterone needed, then increasing your testosterone level does not make you more likely to engage in sexual activity, but it could be that it does only because of a placebo effect. You expect to be more interested in sexual behavior, therefore you are more interested, but it probably is a placebo effect. Okay, one other thing to say before we start the information on sexual differentiation. If we're talking about sexual behaviors, we have that sexual attraction, the appetitive behaviors, copulation, and then postcopulatory behaviors, which would include parenting. So the exact type of parenting that is needed is going to depend on the species. So there are some species that are considered altricial. So these are animals that are born in an undeveloped state, or at least an underdeveloped state, and therefore they have to have parental care. If you think about human infants, I don't know how much time you guys have spent around newborns, they can't do a whole lot. They can cry to signal to you that they have a need, but they can't care for themselves. So some species are more likely to need more parental care. So it would make sense for those species to do internal fertilization for then at least mom, and maybe dad as well, but at least mom to be around when the individual is born to meet needs. On the other hand, there are some species that are precocial, which means they're born in a relatively developed state. They would still be smaller, of course, but better able to care for themselves. So to escape from predators, to find food, that kind of thing. So, for example, if you have an animal that's giving birth on the savannah and there are lions around, it would be a good thing if your offspring could run pretty quickly. And so there may be some species that can walk and run within hours of being born versus human infants that take at least 9 or 10 months to be able to walk, and not very steadily at that point. Okay, so we've been talking about sexual behaviors. Now we're going to switch gears to a related conversation about sexual differentiation. So sexual differentiation is the process by which an individual will develop either male or female bodies and behaviors. We're going to talk specifically now about bodies, and then in class on Tuesday we'll talk about the behaviors that can come. And we'll see that it might be a little bit easier to categorize body parts as male or female versus behaviors, that there are very few behaviors that we find only in one sex, but more on that on Tuesday. So in mammals, including us, this is a process that begins before birth. So you're about to see that there are sex chromosomes that are present from the moment of conception that will then start this process. So it's going to start at the very beginning, but then it's going to continue on into adulthood because of things like puberty, for example, and the hormones that come with that carry on this process of sexual differentiation. So it's not something that happens all at once, but sex determination is something that happens all at once. So with sex determination, this is where we have those chromosomes that are doing their job. Okay, so the female sex cell is an egg or an ovum. The female sex cell always has one X chromosome. I'm saying this as if there's not something wrong. We will talk about some rare cases where things can go wrong in class on Tuesday, but assuming things are going typically, female egg has one X, and then sperm can either have an X or a Y, which means that if female gives an X, which she will, because she has to, then male gives an X, then you have a female offspring. So XX would be female chromosome, we've produced a daughter. If mom gives an X, which she has to, and dad gives a Y, then you have XY chromosomes, that's a male offspring. You got a son there. Okay. Now, what this means is that the male is the one that determines the sex of the offspring. So, briefly, I don't know if I've told you guys this in this particular section or not, I enjoy reading, listening to, on Audible, historical fiction. Sorry, go ahead and judge me if you want to, that's fine. And I'm interested in the Tudor line, like Henry VIII. So Henry VIII, for those of you who might not be aware, had 6 wives. There's a little rhyme to help you remember. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. That's what happened to his 6 wives. So without going into any great detail, his first wife gave him a daughter, Princess Mary, but was not able to produce a living son. So she had several babies that tragically did not survive, but she had one daughter that did. And he wanted to have a son, needed to have a son to pass on his throne, so then he went on to create his own church just so he could divorce his wife, and then married Anne Boleyn, and then she gave him a daughter, Princess Elizabeth, but then no male heirs. So he had her beheaded. Was she guilty or not of the crime? Who knows, but she was beheaded. And so therefore, and go on, and he did end up having one son that lived out of his 6 wives, but didn't live very long. Like, he died at, I don't know, 16 or so. But the point is, he created all this problems, created a new church, killing his wives, divorcing his wives because they wouldn't give him a son. Whose fault was it that Henry VIII didn't have a son? Well, he would have beheaded me for saying this, but it's his fault because the male determines the sex of the child. Sorry for the rant on Henry VIII. Back to lecture. Okay, so here's what we're going to see. When we have an individual very early on in development, we have an embryo here. We're talking about an individual that has indifferent gonads. What this means is that the embryo is going to have all of the parts to go on to become male or female. So you have indifferent gonads that could develop into testes or could develop into ovaries depending on the situation. Whether the gonads develop into ovaries or testes is determined by the SRY gene. Okay, there's going to be a nice chart that you'll see that will be helpful with this. If an individual has XY chromosomes, they are genetically male. If you have a Y chromosome, there's a portion on the Y chromosome called the SRY gene. That causes testes to be produced. And then the testes will start to produce testosterone that will continue this process of male development. If an individual has XX chromosomes, they don't have a Y chromosome. So therefore, they don't have the SRY gene. So therefore, there are no testes, no significant amount of testosterone, and ovaries develop instead, and the individual will be female. Okay, so if you have XY, then you are genetically male. Then that male will have the SRY gene that will lead to the production of testes, that will lead to the production of testosterone. Okay, so hormones that are secreted by the testes are going to play a role in continuing that sexual differentiation. Humans, to a certain extent, are by default female. If we don't have the presence of testosterone, then a female body will be produced. But you have to have something happen here, particularly you have to have testosterone produced to have the individual develop into a male. So embryos are going to have the structures necessary to develop both male or female parts early on. So what you're going to see is that you have that indifferent gonad, which will develop into a testis or into ovaries. Testes or ovaries, plural. And you also have this internal plumbing system. So the Wolffian ducts and the Mullerian ducts are both present early on. The Wolffian ducts would go on to develop into the male tubing, and the Mullerian ducts would go on to develop into the female tubing. Okay. All right, so here's what you see. This is a picture of an individual at 6 weeks gestation, so very early on. We have an indifferent, why can I not think of it? It's not differentiated. Generic gonad at the moment. Okay, there we go. You have a generic gonad here that could develop into a testis, or testes, plural, or it could be an ovary, depending on the situation. You also have the Wolffian ducts. So if this individual is going to go on to become a male, the Wolffian ducts are going to hang around. If this individual is going to go on to become a female, the Mullerian ducts will hang around. So at this point, everything is still here to develop into male or female. You see this genital tubercle here that could develop into a penis, or it could develop into a clitoris, depending on how this process is going to go. And the major thing that will impact what happens is the presence or absence of testosterone. So, if you have an XX chromosomes, then that means that you will not have an SRY gene. So you will not develop testes. So the gonads will turn into ovaries. Therefore, there won't be significant testosterone. And that means that the female ducts will develop and the Wolffian system will degenerate. So the Mullerian ducts are the female ducts. The Wolffian system is the male system. So here we're saying we don't need that Wolffian system. That will degenerate. The Mullerian system is going to involve the oviducts, which is going to be the fallopian tubes. That's where fertilization is supposed to take place. Uterus, where developing fetus, whatever, would be developing. And then the vagina as well. Now, If you have XY chromosomes, that means that you have the SRY gene, which means that the indifferent gonad develops into testes if it's plural, which will then produce sperm, and testosterone, all that later. And so because of that, you're going to need the Wolffian ducts to develop. So these are the ducts that take the sperm from the testicles and send them out to be added into semen. And so I don't expect you to know all of the structures here and their specific functions, but they're all just tubes that help carry the sperm where it needs to be. So we have the male system, which is the Wolffian system. That's going to develop if you have XY chromosomes, and the Mullerian system will shrink. If you have XX chromosomes, you're going to have the Mullerian system grow and the Wolffian system shrink. So here's a picture at 8 weeks gestation, so we're a couple weeks further on than we were a second ago. So you can start to see a bit of a differentiation here. So we have this Wolffian system that is developing, the male ducts here. We have the female Mullerian ducts that are starting to fade away, and you'll start to see that we have some changes down here that look a little bit more male. Now, you still would not be able to tell on an ultrasound if you have a male or female. These structures are very small and not very differentiated at this point. Usually you have to be at least maybe 16 weeks or so to find out if you're having a boy or girl. Now on the female side here, you'll see that the Mullerian system is developing and the Wolffian system is fading away. And we have structures that look a little bit more female over here. All right, now we've moved ahead to 15 weeks of gestation. So this is almost at the point where you can tell on an ultrasound if you're having a boy or a girl, depending on what kind of ultrasound machine you have and how powerful it is. I found out at 16 weeks with my last two children if they were going to be boys or girls. So what you're going to see here is that we have the Wolffian system fairly developed. The Mullerian system is essentially gone here. You're going to see that we have the penis starting to develop, the scrotal swelling where the testes are going to be located. All of that is developing over here. Now for the female side of things, we have that Mullerian system, the female tubing, the Wolffian system is fading away, and then you have female structures here. You see the clitoris, vagina, etc. Okay, last couple of things before we're done for this lecture video, okay? It's important to know that females would essentially be the default setting, and that in order for an individual to develop as a male, we have to have certain hormones, one of which is testosterone, which we talked about. Testosterone promotes the development of the Wolffian system, so the male tubing, and it's also going to be important for the development of the penis, which we'll talk about in a second. But you also need anti-Mullerian hormone. So for a male to develop his Wolffian system, he needs testosterone. And to get rid of the Mullerian system, he needs anti-Mullerian hormone. So you have one that's increasing the Wolffian system and one that is getting rid of the Mullerian system. Now in females, they don't have either one of these, which means there's nothing to promote the Wolffian system, so it will fade away. And there's nothing to prevent the Mullerian system, so it will develop. So females don't have either of these in much levels at this point. Females will later in life have some testosterone, but males need to have both. Okay, now as I said, testosterone is important not just for the development of male ducts, but also it's important for the development of a penis. So it's a process here where testosterone on its own is not powerful enough to create the necessary male genitalia, penis, scrotum, etc. It needs to be converted into a more potent or powerful form. So 5-alpha reductase is an enzyme that is going to take testosterone and change it into a more potent form called dihydrotestosterone. So it is possible for an individual, and we'll talk about this next time, to have normal levels of testosterone, but if they don't have this enzyme to take that testosterone and make it more potent, then the penis and scrotum might not fully develop. So I hope you can see here that there are several things that are necessary for an individual to develop into a male, that developing into a female is more of the generic form or the more default setting for a human. Okay, this is where I intend to pick up class on Tuesday, so we'll talk about this then. But you can see if you have an XY chromosome, then the SRY gene is expressed. That will cause testes to develop. when you have testes that will produce the testosterone that will develop the Wolffian system and will produce anti-Mullerian hormone that will get rid of the Mullerian system. And then the testosterone can be converted by that 5-alpha reductase process into a more potent form that will then cause the external or phenotypic sex to develop for male penis scrotum. For females with XX chromosomes, you don't have a Y, so you don't have an SRY gene, so the gonad develops into ovaries that don't produce the anti-Mullerian hormone or testosterone, which means that without testosterone, the Wolffian system will not develop. And without anti-Mullerian hormone, the Mullerian system will develop. And because you don't have much in the way of testosterone, then you don't have this process that leads to a penis or scrotum, so then you have a clitoris and outer vagina, that kind of thing that forms. Okay. So this is a good place to leave it. We will pick up with this information on Tuesday. Please don't forget that you can email your activity to me before class on Tuesday for credit. Even if you weren't in class on Thursday, that's fine. I asked you to talk about some appetitive behaviors that you might see in a human species, so behaviors that are intended to make sexual activity more likely to happen. So I do apologize for having to end class abruptly. I appreciate your flexibility. I'll see you guys on Tuesday.